This is Harsh Rules. I'm Ben Harsh, and today we're going to learn to play Heroes of Normandie. Heroes of Normandie is a World War II light tactical war game based on Hollywood movies. As you can tell from the artwork, Heroes of Normandie is less of a historical reenactment and more of a celebration of World War II movies during the 60s and 70s, particularly movies like Kelly's Heroes, Where Eagles Dare, Guns and Navarone, and those type of adventure World War II movies. Make no mistake though, despite the goofy, funny art, this is a very solid World War II tactical system. The game's designers, Jan and Clem, understand that tactical war games have a lot of statistics, and they've done a great job implementing as much of the information as possible onto the actual units. The idea being to spend more time playing the actual game and less time chasing down rules in the rulebook. Now I'm going to take you through a briefing of the first scenario, Godsend. A small reconnaissance unit from the 4th Infantry Division is walking through the Normandy countryside. At the edge of the grove, William, a guy from Brooklyn, thinks he sees movement a little farther ahead. A parachute supporting a lifeless spy's body descends gently. He probably has documents of great importance on him. Wilhelm, a guy from Munich who is driving the Panzerschleier with his buddies, sees the American patrol at that very moment. Instead of getting together and knocking back a few beers, the two groups prefer to compete for possession of the documents that are likely to be ultra mega top secret. So get your bets together, people. It's time to set up Heroes of Normandie, the first scenario, Godsend. In the first step, you're going to place game boards C2B and C1B on the game table. In the second step, you're going to place the turn counter and some turn markers. In step 3, you're going to place damage markers on the board as you see here, as well as placing the files marker off to the side. A quick note, this is not usually what the damage markers are for. We're using these in this particular scenario to track where the parachute's going to come down. In step 4, you're going to identify the deployment zones. The American is the first 2 columns on the left, and the German is the first 2 columns on the right. Now in round 2, we're going to roll a dice, and the number will correspond to the damage marker and where the parachute will land. Since essentially this is a race for the documents, if you place your squads, you're going to want to try to figure out a way so you can cover all the potential locations the parachute could land. Okay, we're going to pause for a moment and look at the components we have on the board and what they mean so far. The first component we're going to look at is the turn counter, which you can see on the left side of the page. Besides allowing you to keep track of what turn you're on, the turn marker also has a number of points where you can have separate events happen. In the Godsend scenario, those are marked by the exclamation point marker. The first event occurs in round 2, where the parachute drops to the ground. You're going to roll a dice to determine where on the map the documents land. In turn 3, during the supply phase, the second event will occur, which will be reinforcements will arrive in the form of light vehicles. Each side will get a reinforcement. The Germans will receive an SDKFZ 254-1 Puma, and the Americans will receive a half-track, an M3A1. Finally, you can see that the scenario ends on turn 6. At that time, either one of the two sides will have recovered the documents and taken them back to the deployment zone, or the rain destroys the documents. Okay, in step 5, you're going to place your platoon template and your deployable platoon markers on the board. Okay, now we get to the fun part. Each platoon template lists the number of squads that are available in that platoon for the scenario. Now Godsend just uses the bare bones template that has an officer, a recon team, a fire team, and a support team. However, in later scenarios, or if you're making your own scenarios, you can build your own platoons using these empty spots on the template. This is what the hero system looks like. You have your platoon template, and then you have a set of recruitment tiles that fit into those holes in the template, which are then corresponding to deployment tiles that you put on the actual game board. Now, besides being the right size to fit in the hole, there is also a color-banded ribbon on the side of each tile. Those ribbons need to match the template to be used with that platoon. Let's take a closer look at one of the deployment tiles we will be using in the Godsend scenario. This is a support team, and the key statistics are listed on the bottom of the tile, which makes it very convenient for playing this game. The purple movement arrow shows you the number of squares that this particular squad can move. There's a group of symbols at the bottom middle of the tile that will show how this particular team corresponds with fellow units for attack and defense. The gold shield in the center shows that this support team has a defense of 4. The surrounding icons show how the attack bonus for this unit can be applied if attacking another infantry unit, a light vehicle, or a heavy vehicle. To the right you'll see a little skull with circling arrows around it. This is how many times the unit can be hit. This particular unit can be hit twice before it is removed from the game. Once it's hit once, you will flip the tile over. Here you can see the different types of units as well as what happens when you flip them over. So the support team will flip over and you'll see that 1, it has less men now visible because they've suffered casualties, and they have a red skull at the bottom. So if they are hit one more time, they're removed from the game. In the middle group of tiles, you'll see that those already start with a red circled skull. They can only take 1 hit before they're removed from the game. The flip side of these markers have a hidden symbol on them, which can be used in some scenarios. And finally, we have special units. This is a 30 caliber unit on the right hand side. As you can see, the first tile, side A, they're mobile, and side B, they're armed and set up. Regardless of whether they're armed or mobile, you can see that they have a red skull. So if they're hit once in either position, they're taken out of the game. Now you can see while all tiles have 2 sides, the flip side means something different for certain tiles. Now let's return to setting up the game. In step 6, you're going to place the strategy decks, the dice, and the order markers in the play area. Then each player will draw 4 cards from their deck. In Heroes of Normandie, each player will have a deck of cards that help them in the game. They're fairly straightforward. For example, this Tactician card basically gives you 1 more order so you can activate an additional unit in the game. The cards have a number of symbols that'll tell you when the card can be played and the effect the card has on the game. The only complicated thing about the cards is that some scenarios, especially the early ones, require you to remove quite a few cards that aren't needed. For example, in the Godsend scenario, you do not need any air or artillery cards. There are no heavy vehicles, so they ask you to remove these cards as well. Since Godsend is a training scenario, this seems a little egregious, but you can either remove the cards prior to play, or you can just ignore these cards if you draw them. Whatever works best for you. Okay, now that our game is set up and we have a kind of a basic feel for it, let's go through the gameplay. Each turn in Heroes of Normandie is divided up into 3 phases. In the order phase, you're going to place orders on your units that you wish to take action with. The activation phase, you're going to choose which units are going to assault, move, or fire. And in the supply phase, you're going to move any units that have not conducted combat. So first is the order phase. In the order phase, you receive an order token for each star that you have in your platoon. You will also receive 1 bluff token to place to confuse your enemy. So on the game board, you want to place your tokens down on the units you want to activate in the order you want to activate them in. Your opponent is going to do the same thing, and they're going to use the bluff token to try to throw you off on which units they're going to use. Next is the activation phase. In this phase, you're going to take turns with your opponent activating the units that you set up with your order tokens. With each activation, you have a choice. You can move your unit, conduct an assault, or fire. So back at the game board, our first unit that we're going to activate can really only move at this point since no one else is in range. So let's take a closer look at that. So here we see that our support team has a movement of 3. So they can move 3 squares per turn, and they can move diagonally. Now one of our options is to step into a bush and take cover. If we do that, we get a bonus of +2 cover. Instead, we're going to choose to try to close the distance to one of the potential landing points of the parachute. So on the game board, we're going to move 3 spaces and close the distance to either 3 or 4 as a landing point or 6. Now it's the Germans' turn to activate their order number 1, and they're in pretty much the same boat. So they're going to move 3 spaces diagonally to get as close as possible to number 1. America then activates their second order, and we're going to move him 3 spaces to get closer to 2. Germany activates their second order and moves as close as they can to 3, 4, or 5. So now that we revealed all our activated units, we're going to remove the bluffs. Next is the supply phase. We're going to redeploy any remaining units on the board that have not moved and conducted combat. And it's important to remember that we cannot conduct combat during the supply phase. Since they had the initiative, the Americans get to move their units first, and then the Germans get to move their units. Finally, the supply phase is a bit of a cleanup phase, so let's look at this checklist. So we've removed our bluff tokens. You can also discard 1 suppressed marker, which we haven't done yet. Check to see if there's any card actions, special abilities, or recruitment options that need to be resolved. You can discard any of your 4 cards and draw 4 new ones, or you can just keep the hand you have. So we're just going to keep our hand. You're going to reset the number of order tokens you have to play in the next turn. And this is mainly if you've suffered a casualty that have eliminated a star, so you have less orders. So that's something we don't need to worry about right now. Check the scenario for events and victory conditions. There's no events during this phase. Finally, you're going to flip over the initiative marker and move it to the next turn. So the Americans had initiative in the first turn. In the second turn, the Germans get the initiative. And that's it. It's off to turn 2. Quick overview of turn 2. We're going to have the order phase again, the activation phase, and the supply phase. And we need to remember that there's an event. So at the end of turn 2 supply phase, we're going to roll a d6 to determine where the parachute with the files lands. First, both sides are going to place their order tokens. This turn, Germany has the initiative, so we're going to start with order number 1. So during the activation phase, we can choose between move, assault, or fire. So the German unit's going to take a shot at the American. We want to make sure that works with line of sight, and now let's take a look. The American recon team has a defensive 5. Our German fire group has a +2 versus infantry, so therefore we need to get at least a 3 to hit. We roll the dice and we get a 2, which is a miss. So now we switch to America order number 1, and guess what? He's going to fire back. The fire group has a defensive 4, and the recon team has a +1, so we need at least a 3 to hit. We roll the dice, and the recon team gets a 6, so they score a hit. So the fire group can take 2 hits, so we flip it over, and we can see what its stats look like now that it's damaged. The damaged fire group now only has a +1 against infantry, and it has no modifier against light vehicles. Strangely enough, their defense now goes up +1, probably because they have less people and they're harder to hit. Now we switch to German order number 2, and we're going to move a unit closer to the 3-4 position. For America's order 2, they're going to try to move to the position 5 where the parachute might land. Now it's turn for the supply phase, and we can only use units that have not been activated. So first we're going to reposition the German units since they had the initiative. And next we're going to reposition the American units to try to get them closer to where we hope the parachute will drop. Okay, we've waited long enough. It's now time to find out where the parachute with the files lands. We roll the 6-sided dice and we get a 6, so it lands on position 6, practically right on top of the German officer. Now it's time for game turn 3, and we need to remember that in the supply phase of game turn 3, reinforcements are going to arrive. So the first phase is we're going to place our orders. This turn, America has the initiative, so we're going to activate order number 1. Once again, we have 3 choices: move, assault, or fire. Our recon team decides to assault the German officer. To conduct an assault, you need enough movement points to be able to enter the square with the enemy unit. Basically, this is hand-to-hand combat, so you're going to run in and jump this guy and hope that you can win. And basically, whoever rolls the highest dice score wins. The assault skill allows you to roll 2 dice and keep the highest result. If the enemy unit does not have an assault skill, they only get to roll 1 dice. But since this one has an assault skill, they get to do the same thing. So they roll 2 dice and they keep their highest score. So both sides roll their dice. The Americans roll a 6 and a 1, and the Germans roll a 3 and a 1. You then add any modifiers, so our American unit has a +1 and the German unit has a +2. The American unit has the higher roll, so the German unit takes a hit and are flipped over. The American unit takes the square and pushes the German unit back into the adjacent square. And that's how assaults work. Now our German unit has survived the assault, and now it's Germany's order number 1, which is the same unit. The German unit is going to move past the American unit and use one of its movement points to pick up the files. American order number 2, the American officer takes a shot at the German officer who just picked up the files. The American officer needs at least a 4 to hit. The American officer rolls a 3 and misses. German order number 2, the fire group takes a shot at the recon group. They need at least a 4 to hit. The German fire group rolls a 5 and they hit and kill the recon group. Phew! Now we're in the supply phase and we're going to move the units that weren't activated. First we move our American units. And then we move our German units, which we're going to move to try to protect the wounded officer with the files. So here's the final position for all our units in turn 3. Okay, we're in the supply phase, so each side is going to deploy their reinforcement into their deployment zone. Let's take a closer look at these light vehicles. The light vehicles are in a different class, so they have purple shields that identify how much health they have. So for the M3A1, it has a health of 6. For the SDKFZ-254-1 Puma, it has a health of 8. Light vehicles are very simple. Once they're hit, they flip over and they're blown up. While we're here, let's cover off on heavy vehicles, which are much more complicated, and you'll run into those in later scenarios. First of all, you'll notice that heavy vehicles have armor on 4 sides, so they can be targeted on any of those 4 sides. They also often have a primary weapon and a secondary weapon that each have its own stats. Finally, if you score a hit on a heavy vehicle, you roll a 6-sided dice to determine what damage markers to apply. If you roll a 1, the crew is hit and it can only fire 1 weapon. If you roll a 2, the track is hit and it cannot move. If you roll a 3 or a 4, the hull is hit and the vehicle immediately stops and you add 2 suppression markers to it. Roll a 5 and the primary weapon is destroyed. Roll a 6 and the heavy vehicle itself is completely destroyed. And that's a sneak peek at the heavy vehicle mechanics. Okay, vehicles move a little differently than troops, so let's take a look at that with a driving tutorial. Vehicles have a lot more movement points, but they also can make a lot different moves. So if you are stationary and you turn left or right 45 degrees, it costs you 1 movement point. Forward and reverse also cost you 1 movement point. So basically you can move farther, but if you need to position yourself carefully, you can end up burning a bunch of movement points. Okay, so now we've officially reached turn 4, so let's get on with it. First is the order phase, so we're going to place our order tokens, and this time we have vehicles, so we might want to use those or we might not. Germany has the initiative, so order number 1, the officer who's carrying the files is going to try to run for the end zone. America order number 1, I'm going to floor it, drive up and around between the 2 Germans, and try to chase down that officer. Now I don't have enough points to assault him and run him down. Perhaps if I made use of some of my cards, I could get an extra boost and be able to nail him, but we're going to skip that for now and look at this in a little more detail. Now typically in Heroes of Normandy, troops have a zone of control that prevents them from passing through each other. An enemy troop can enter another troop's zone However, vehicles are not impacted by a squad's zone of control, so I'm able to drive between the two squads. You couldn't normally do this with another squad. One strategy seems to be that you can put squads near each other and kind of form a wall of control to keep the enemy out, except it doesn't keep vehicles out. For German order number 2, the squad decides to shoot at the speeding vehicle and they need to roll a 6. And they get a 6 and the vehicle explodes. We quickly shift to America order number 2 and that squad attempts to race across the lane to see if they can stop the fleeing officer. And with that, we're going to end the tutorial on a cliffhanger. So, will the Germans get the file out? Will the Americans stop them? It's up to you to find out. So you can play the game and see how it plays out for you. So before I close out the video, I wanted to cover off on a few more rules because there are a lot in this game and we've just barely scratched the surface. The first is equipment modifiers. In Heroes of Normandie, there are several extra pieces of equipment that you can use to modify your dice rolls. For example, with ammunition, you can use it to add an additional modifier to your attack roll, so it's a little bit easier to attack. You can attack with an extra +1. There are also grenades and other explosives that you can use, and this is how you use them. The center of 4 squares is called an interspace, and interspaces are where you target throwing grenades and other explosives. Each grenade or other explosive projectile will have an interspace range, which is marked by the lines with the blue dots. Grenades have an interspace range of 2, so you can throw it from your interspace 2 additional interspaces to target an enemy. If you score a hit, the grenade explodes and affects all squares next to the interspace. So in this example, there are 2 fire groups that are going to be caught in the blast. And that's just a quick look at a few pieces of equipment that you can give to your men in Heroes of Normandie. Finally, it wouldn't be a tactical light war game if we didn't cover off a little bit on suppressive fire. In Heroes of Normandie, certain units have a suppressive fire ability. Instead of taking a normal shot, the unit can perform suppressive fire. Basically, the unit will double all its bonuses and then roll the dice. If the score exceeds the unit's defense shield, then you place a -2 suppression marker on the unit. If you roll the equivalent of twice the defense value, then you get to place 2 of these -2 suppression markers on the unit. Each suppression marker subtracts 2 from each of the unit's stats. So that's from their movement stats, from their attack stats, everything. So just a couple markers will pretty much immobilize them. And that's how Heroes of Normandie handles suppressive fire. And that just about wraps up today's episode. Heroes of Normandie is a very interesting tactical war game. There is a number of rules and expansions for it, and no doubt we will return to revisit this title to go over some more rules. But for now, that you should have enough to be able to get started and get your feet wet with this really nice game. I'd also like to recommend the PC version of Heroes of Normandie, which I think is going to be released for the iPad fairly soon. This is a really slick version of the game, and I enjoy it a lot. So check it out. I'm Ben Harsh for Harsh Rules, and I'll see you on the next episode.